Фала ви на сите што дојдовте. Мене ми е многу драго што вечерва имаме Јасмина Цибиц, авторка која е препознатлива по незиното творештво по последните 15 и повеќе години. Претпоставам дека повеќето од вас се сеќаваат дека тоа не е прво гостување. Само за прв пат имаме во Скопје. Имаше самостојно изложба во Националната галерија. Беше учесник во проектот Диалог во Јадро. Ние исто имавме среќа да ја видиме како дел од колекцијата на Deutsche Telekom со изложбата You Can See Me Moving Placeless. И за наша среќа имаме исто тука. Таа е дел од еден престој кој е поврзан со незината истражувачка работа околу архивите на Музеот на современа уметност. Јасмина има интересен пристап кој се заснова на едно подолгорочно истражување. Не интересираат структурите на MoCA, таа се интересира највеќе за она што се нарекува soft power. Јас со нетрпение очекувам да чуеме незината презентација, бидејќи се сеќавам добро дека на она незино представување кое беше во рамки на програмата на Јадро, тоа го направи на еден феноменален начин, многу елоквентно и сигурен сум дека посебно и за студентите кои се дел тука ќе биде доста информативно и ќе ги натера да размислуваат за методологиите на работа, за пристапот и што значи да се биде во права смисла современ, да се третираат глобални теми од позиција на нашиот регион. Со тоа ја продолжувам и таа соработка, посебно со луѓе кои доаѓаат од Словенија, меѓутоа работат и живеат подолго време надвор. И мислам дека ова е супер прилика да ја слушнеме. Many of us heard about Jasmina's work. She was representing Slovenia at the Venice Biennale, and so many important exhibitions. So not to take your time further, you can hear directly from the artist. So Jasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I will speak in English. I think I have an excuse. There's a few people who can only speak English, so I feel a bit better about the language. And language and translations, I think, is kind of a theme I would like to bring out, and also an invitation to you all for questions, for debates. And from what I managed to understand, it's a really big question for us coming from these territories about how the international arena sees us. And yes, I work with archives a lot. I've worked with historical ready-mades for a really long time. And I've been in London for 20 years. I went to Goldsmiths, and this was one of the first points of inquiry I had into this ideas of geopolitical exoticism and what the international world of art wants to, or which drawer they want to fit us in. So I guess my entire practice has been trying to resist that. It's been trying to work with themes that are close to me, that I feel are urgent for our contemporary condition, but I also wanted to open them up as an invitation to international audiences to show why they are global topics and not sort of case studies of geopolitical exoticism. And just to sort of guide you quickly a little bit through sort of the starts of the practice. I started actually in a performative practice with 3 other artists, and we were creating, so this is very early work, this is 2002, we were creating this fictitious waiting rooms, fictitious border controls on trains passing national borders between Italy and Slovenia, so this is sort of just before Schengen. We were doing this sort of absurd exchange stations. On the left, this is in the National Gallery in Sarajevo, where spectators had to fill in really stupid bureaucratic forms to get these hygiene kits. So there was this whole idea of, what is the role of the artist? Are they a gatekeeper or a giver of experience, really? And I very quickly exchanged my physical presence for, let's say, sort of like a performativity of absence. So I started working with authority mechanisms, So this is one of the projects I've done with the Slovenian Police State Orchestra. It was a performance done when Slovenia had the right-wing government for the first time in 2007. And the then Prime Minister, Janez Janša, who then made a resurrection, and it's kind of threatening he's going to have another one, he came up with this slogan, "I feel love," which was an unofficial slogan for Slovenia, because Slovenia has love in its name, and he thought it was cool. So we made a transcript of "I Feel Love" for the Police State Orchestra that otherwise plays for dignitaries, diplomacy that arrive to the one airport we have. And we did this performance initially at the airport, and this was when the airport was expanding, so they sort of renovated it. It was this beautiful architecture which they obviously replaced, and I wanted to enter as an artist before any advertisement and any other colonization of the capital would happen, and I played only with the symbols and elements of the airport itself. There was neon signs, police, orchestra, and then we did another version at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana. And what was really interesting was that the art audience, when they were invited to enter at the newly built airport, they didn't quite know what to do with themselves. Yet the actual users of the airport were really enjoying and playing and kind of like sliding through the feet of the police playing. And it was really kind of this, this kind of continuation of this conversation with, with behavioral patterns of the audience and ideas of illusionism and how do we ascribe to the authority of the space. And this idea of behavioral patterns and movement through space, I kind of wanted to address a bit more in this relationship between the art space and the space of authority. And this is the Slovenian Pavilion in Venice in 2013. And this was still when Slovenia had a pavilion outside, I'm sure you all remember it, the APA Gallery, which was this really interesting sort of vitrine, basically. So I played with a number of different sort of pedestals almost, or mechanisms of viewing, from the vitrine to a boudoir to a pedestal, and really kind of wanted to engage with this idea of, what does it mean to represent the nation? Is it still possible? And how artists' artistic positions are chosen, which I'm sure a lot of you in this room share. And what I did was actually I just sort of exchanged in a way this sort of this idea of what is presented. So instead of the sort of artistic position, I brought in a selection of extreme local specifics. So I created a pavilion based on failed and successful national icons from the Slovenian history, from architecture to art to animals, and kind of put them together into a conversation. So it was kind of this transposition of a subject, really. So instead of a state itself, it was sort of this sort of failed and successful representations of it. And we were extremely lucky because we managed to enter into a discussion with the Slovenian Parliament, and they agreed to lend us their art collection. So the paintings on the left-hand side that you see are all paintings that hang behind the backs of politicians in office. And when we started having the conversation with the curator, Teož Logar, we started getting really interested in the collection that never left the walls. And as you can see, you can imagine, the artworks that never left the walls are benign flowers. So this idea of art that doesn't offend and this representative art was kind of a leitmotif, and we actually did a performance for the opening when the two actors were actually hanging the actual artworks. And this is a really interesting collection. It's a really valuable collection, Slovenian Impressionists. It's a collection that was happening until '95, when then the parliament stopped purchasing artworks. And then the rest of the pavilion was mimicking, so you see this kind of paneling. So this is actually the paneling that's taken from the existing room in the parliament. So loads of it was, of course, renovated. They lowered the ceiling that actually caused that they cut the heads of a fresco of all the kind of important Slovenians through history. So this kind of very strange decapitation. But this sort of paneling stayed. And The architect of the Slovenian parliament, which is actually legally termed an extension, which is quite interesting, was Vinko Glanc, who was a student of Plečnik, and he actually landed this commission because he was entrusted with Villa Bled, which was this really interesting case study of a sort of Austro-Hungarian hunting castle that then Yugoslav diplomacy got after Hitler-Jugend actually had it during the war. And apparently Tito said, I want a flat roof. Every single modern president has a flat roof. So there was again this symbolic castration of this Austro-Hungarian hunting castle into this faux modernist palace, really. Anyhow, so we kind of had the paneling, and then another layer that I introduced was so this pattern that you see, which was drawn from endemic beetles that live only in 5 Slovenian caves. And I actually draw on a beetle that is named after Hitler. This is Anophthalmus hitleri, and it's a blind cave beetle, and very, very strangely, it's actually being now hunted by neo-Nazi memorabilia collectors for its name. So the name is actually causing it to become endangered. Now what I did also is that I reversed the rules of the game in a way. So I worked with scientific illustrators from all over the world, and I gave them only the name. And I said, how do you think this beetle could look like based just on the name? So we got a lot of little mustaches, little sort of faux faces, and we covered the entire pavilion. So it was this kind of ornamental rash of ideology in a way. So curtains, costumes of the performers, wallpaper, and kind of created this little kind of Lausian boudoir as well on the top to kind of merge then the presentation. And just to show you the artworks in their original positions. So the top left is the cabinet of the President of the National Assembly, room 119. The top right one is the room where we file referendums. We love referendums. And it's, again, that usual, does the artwork fit the chairs? Does the chair fit the artwork? And the bottom left one is the post office within the parliament. And as you can see, the painting is kind of quite high up. It's quite in a strange position. And we were asking the people in there, sort of, what's this all about? And they said, well, we're just tired of changing the photo of the president. So like this, we don't have to change it ever. It's flowers, it's fine. And then I did, this is when I actually started using film, because it kind of felt that the narrative I wanted to include just needed some sort of a kind of guiding voice. And I did a reconstruction of a parliamentary debate in 1957, which was about how to choose the artist to represent within this newly built National Assembly. And what was really interesting was that the committee members were in the same form as the committee members that were deciding on my position as an artist in 2013. So nothing changed in sort of 50 years. And even more so, the nephew of the man who was really against one artist in 57 was the man who was really against my project. And this is, coming from these territories, this is the story we usually have. These things are incredibly hard to uproot. And then the project basically always was shown as sort of architectural installation that kind of brought in, the certain architectural elements, the films, that then expanded into this committee also constructing the maquette, to kind of like really, play these sort of double games and, kind of bridge and merge and so on. And I basically always work with patterns, I guess. So I look for patterns, but also these cycles of instrumentalization of art and culture for national and political means. And there's, there's this idea of camouflage that I'm quite interested in. And this is a project that also I kind of wanted to show you, because obviously living in Skopje, this situation here is, it's a master situation of camouflage, isn't it? So this is a project I did with actually basing it on the pavilion of the pavilion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia at the World Exposition in Barcelona. And so that's that's 1929, which was this very strange it was basically supposedly a ship-based design that Dragiša Brašov, a Serbian modernist architect, came up with. And supposedly it was representing a Serbian peasant house. And obviously when I saw it, I immediately thought of loss, but I also immediately thought of razzle-dazzle camouflage. And this idea of using these stripes and angles is basically, and it kind of like, I guess, razzle-dazzle camouflage with sort of British naval fleets really shows it much better, that you don't know how far it is, you don't know how big it is. And, you know, this idea of revealing and concealing attention was very, very much of interest, especially when we're talking about nation states. But also there was this idea of this building of desire. This is where Adolf Loos comes in. So this was a house for Josephine Baker. This was not a commission. Adolf Loos thought of this and created this very strange architecture that was, of course, never realized, where on the top floor there was a pool where Josephine was supposed to be swimming naked, and she was to be overlooked by men sitting in a cafe sipping whiskey or whatever. And there was this sort of light paneling on the top that was supposedly then shining into her eyes so she couldn't see who was looking at her. So I wanted to merge all these things to really talk about desire building, female body, and nation states. And also to go back to the expo, you know, sort of these world expositions, which kind of had that role that now maybe European cities of culture have, or really, you know, it was all about set building, scenography, and art and culture were kind of called in as this sort of, yeah, sort of set builders, really. And also the pavilion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had also this sort of central area that was kind of in a way a similar tactic to what Loos was sometimes doing with his sort of points of view, and you know, he was kind of quite a chauvinist, so there was a lot of voyeurism happening in his architecture, especially with the boudoirs. But also the expo pavilions in 29 still had the female figure in front of them. And this was then another conversation I wanted to kind of bring in, you know, this idea of this female figure having to represent, protect, but also create desire. So this kind of almost a irreconcilable position that is also asked from architecture. And I created this lost pavilion because, of course, there's no place, no plans, based on all these architectures. And this was kind of like another video piece coming from that. And then, so speaking of methodology, so what I try to do is, because these are of course very big bodies of work in terms of research and also resources, I tried to bring together museums, institutions, archives, researchers to really create platforms for discussion. And Spielraum was a really good example of that. It was a 3-chapter project that I did with Museum Ludwig in Budapest, Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, and the International Graphic Center in Ljubljana. And I wanted to look at the life of an aesthetic language and how it is created. Is that in my computer? Should I just undo that, maybe? Is that better? No? No, that's not me, that's that. Okay. Okay, I'll just continue. Not. Yeah, you're okay, okay. So it was effectively a 3-chapter project that kind of wanted to look at this idea of, you know, how an aesthetic language is born in order to represent a new ideology. What happens with it when it runs and it functions, and what happens with it when that ideology that commissioned it dies. And for the kind of the background, the aesthetic background of the entire project, I chose the plans for the city of Belgrade for the first conference of the non-aligned. So the archive is the archive of Yugoslavia, and it's a really, really phenomenal archive in terms of drawings of all these things that were, most of them, non-realized. So I turned this archive into this kind of set. I turned it into musical instruments. I kind of extruded it and really used it as a kind of as a set build element. And this was like a number of these installations then that we kind of created. This was Museum Ludwig in Budapest, where then another chapter of the film was filmed. So it was this idea of kind of creating this rolling snowball that the project itself kind of mimicked the, let's say, the idea that the project was kind of working toward. And then this idea of architectural trailers came in. So this was the second project, the second part of the project in Ljubljana. And the ceiling is effectively a remake of the ceiling from the Palace of Federation in Belgrade. So this idea of kind of taking out this element that was kind of very, very specific for this kind of entry into the building, where all the VIPs would be walking in, was sort of installed within the first room that kind of led toward the project, toward the film. So I'm just kind of showing you this just so you kind of get the idea that the installations in the end are kind of quite, they are quite experiential. I try to really kind of unpack those archives then into books and publications. So it's kind of, it is a bit more of a theatrical and expansive experience. The third chapter was filmed in Belgrade, in the palace itself. But what I wanted to do is really kind of use it as the set, but also bring in the female voice. So this is this play that I always kind of have with this sort of absence of the female voice was kind of always present, because of course as soon as you open any of these archives, there are no women present. But in terms of the artworks, what is really interesting is, especially in the former Palace Federation, all the two-dimensional works are very, they are modernist and very sort of in line also with the with what was happening in the West, and all the sculptures are of female nudes, but not only just female nudes, but very highly eroticized female nudes. So I created a film where I had 4 female actresses, and I created a script which is drawing from sort of very sort of international sort of sources, ideas about tearing down. So, just to kind of like point the finger toward this sort of like, specificity and non-specificity, and this sort of like continuous loop of these discussions. What do you do with something when it no longer serves a purpose? So it's a script which is created really from citations. So it's quite fragmented, but you have Margaret Thatcher, you have Hitler, you have ISIS fighters. So the idea was to really kind of bring together this kind of entirety of these different voices. Some were progressive, some were, you can have a conservationist, you have a nation builder, you have an artist, that kind of collide together. The book, I don't know if you have it here, it's a really, really fantastic collection of essays. It's kind of a feminist decoding of nation building. We have Dubravka Sekulić, VHV, Giovanna Zappari, Jelena Vesić, Una Popović, Rona Kopejska, so women. And it's really, really beautiful collection of texts. And this is kind of then what we kind of then try to do, and also publish the archive to kind of make it accessible. And then the second project that I did was I kind of wanted to look at more of a kind of international set of male architects that were designing for the nation. So I looked at 3 different moments. I looked at Międzysław Richter, who did the Yugoslav Pavilion in Brussels in '58. I looked at Mies van der Rohe, and I looked at Arne Jacobsen. So 3 male positions that were invited to represent the nation state during one of the moments of extreme crisis in the 20th century. The project was called Nada, which means hope in our language, but also it means nothing in Spanish, which is, I thought, quite a nice also double game. And this project actually looked at music, it looked at choreography, and it looked at rhetoric through 3 different prisms. So it started with the Richter project, with a model with a building as a model, as it was supposed to be. So basically, the tower, the central sort of the pillar of also his artistic thought, was castrated by the politicians. And this is, 58, so it was all about anti-gravity. So, all the pavilions in Brussels were kind of really competing for this sort of like, this very core idea. So he kind of translated this castration into an artwork, which was then his Nada that kind of stood in front of the pavilion. So I recreated the project as it was supposed to be, but I actually made it into a musical instrument. So I worked with Dejana Sekulić, who is a violinist and an experimental musician, an amazing, amazing artist. And we were basically tuning the model. So in a way, there was also, again, this double game with, an artist tuning on architecture as the committees were tuning the architect. But also, we attempted to tune it in the melodic signature of the piece of the Miraculous Mandarin, which was the ballet that was chosen as one of the key artworks Yugoslavia sent to Brussels. And this was kind of quite a paradoxical choice because the Miraculous Mandarin, so this is a Bela Bartok ballet, which was written in 1927. It was premiered in Cologne in the Opera House, and Adenauer was actually the mayor then, and he prohibited it as soon as it came out, because there was this big uproar, because it was modernist music, people didn't understand it. But this is also the same time as Mies van der Rohe was building the villas in Krefeld, so, which were, of course, highly modernist. So, you know, it was again this idea of, you know, modernism was okay for the elite, but not for the masses. But then furthermore, the Bela Bartok was, I mean, the ballet itself actually has the storyline of a prostitute and 3 pimps that use the prostitute to steal money, basically, from rich clients. And this was sort of the selected artwork that went to Brussels. So again, quite a nice metaphor of nation states, prostitution, and where does art and architecture stand. So I was trying to trace it, and this is just before Yugoslav television started, so there's no proper recording. So we had about 12 photographs, and I basically reconstructed it with taking nationalist painting and the figures of the maiden, Kosovska Devojka, of course, but I was just changing the elements for the Richter elements. So there was just this little exchange from this very loaded objects to this supposedly non-loaded object of modernism, which of course we all know are not loaded. And we filmed this in the Arne Jacobsen Town Hall in Aarhus, and I was invited for the European City of Culture to do a project, and I thought this was a really, really good moment to bring this work in, because of also this echo of what European cities of culture are trying to do, and this idea of inviting artists to reignite the cultural capital. And really, I wanted to really play, you know, this, I mentioned this idea of this double game a lot, but, you know, just really to also be quite self-critical in, you know, in this idea of, you know, when you come as an artist, you know, into another situation, are you a tourist, can you engage, how can you engage? And a lot of the times with my work, I am invited into conditions where, you know, maybe the director of the museum or of a festival doesn't know how to say something, and then they invite the artist that, you know, does that. So this is also a very, very interesting sort of kind of, let's say, sort of self-imposed commission, and you know, debating it and problematizing it also. And the work was really, I mean, you know, you can imagine, so Arne Jacobsen, really highly polished, beautiful, beautiful modernist building, and we effectively mapped it with this newly developed, retraced choreography. And the 3rd chapter of Nada focused on the rhetoric. So this is now a return to Krefeld, which I mentioned. So Mies van der Rohe was basically chosen as the representative for the German pavilion because of these projects he was doing in Krefeld. So he was building these effectively pavilions for the wealthy art collectors, Lange and Esters. And this is now a museum. So they are kind of, there is a collection, but also the building itself, of course, is, you know, it's a fully functional Misean, you know, masterpiece. So I kind of wanted to look at the words that were used by these selection committees again, and what I did was actually like a sort of a cut through time through 3 different German pavilions at a world exposition. So you have Mies in Barcelona, and then you have the Nazi Germany, and then you have the 58 German pavilion with Eiermann. And this is maybe a really good illustration of what I'm interested in, is this kind of, you know, how Eiermann kind of sort of reaffirms or kind of goes back to Mies to kind of go, we're not that Germany anymore, we're again the democratic Germany continuing the Weimar discourse through architecture. And I created a new film, which was filmed in the villa, and I had 3 female figures again, who are voicing these 3 Germanys in a way. And you can imagine that the voices of the archive, the only thing that changed was whether it was figurative or abstract. And again, the exhibition that happened within the space itself, I took out these missing elements, so you kind of have this light box. So basically, you kind of always played with these three elements. You kind of have the female nude, you have the light box, and you have the white walls. But here I kind of did a little bit of a revenge. So I covered his white walls with a curtain. And this curtain I was actually taking from two other artists from Krefeld. One actually had frescoes in the main museum in Krefeld that were covered to be protected in front of the Allied bombing. And the other one was a Jewish artist whose work was actually protected because there was a wallpaper over a house which was actually a Nazi headquarters. So this idea of hiding, revealing, showing was kind of coming into play. And we presented then some more projects that were kind of spanning from this body of work in the Baltic. So again, is this idea of kind of creating this sort of pathways for the audience before they arrive into the films. Same here, this was Montreal, Phi Foundation. So this is the wallpaper that was drawn, it's quite old work. It was drawn from the archives of Tito's photographers. So I was working with the Museum of Yugoslavia a lot, with the images of, our heritage, but also really looking at the moments of when these structures were being built. And this was actually kind of happening, sort of before the MoMA exhibition, and I think we could kind of talk about that a bit after. But this idea of, kind of constructing these landscapes, and also, so I was using the images of the photographers that were hired by the state to follow the Yugoslav diplomacy, and I was interested in these moments of when they were turning away from the diplomacy that they were supposedly documenting, and they took photos of the landscape. So it was more about the landscape and, questioning this idea of, is there still this poetic possibility within these structures? And just sort of to show you a bit also how these projects work, they always depart from architecture. So this was the Phi Foundation situation. So within the kind of more white cubey spaces, this idea of these foyers and films. But when it's kind of like a more ambiental situation, I kind of create these almost kind of fictitious sort of collector rooms, where then these sort of elements are sort of extruded and positioned within. And same goes for, this was a performance that I did with a set of kilims that basically was kind of starting to bring in these voices, these female voices that I otherwise going to have in the films, into the actual ambient and in front of the spectators. And I wanted to also share with you the film that I did called The Gift, which was created, so it's basically a film that is created entirely from political gifts of culture. So it's filmed within 4 buildings that were all gifts. So Budujla, Palace of Nations in Geneva, Niemeyer's Communist headquarters in Paris, and of course the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. And I basically wanted to kind of look at these sort of architectural donations that were kind of done to this idea of this modern international community, and kind of really question this sort of culture's role, I guess, as a political style bearer, Trojan horse, cultural diplomacy, and political interest, but also to kind of create this almost like this effect of kind of like, it's kind of like a return of reality, that the film kind of uses the manifestation of political action as decoration to art, rather than the other way around. So it's kind of also quite a tentative project. And it's effectively also a film about culture and ourselves, and in times of political and ideological crisis. And really to kind of, we all kind of sit there and kind of like tick boxes and what the project will do, how it will help old ladies cross the street, how it will reignite, whatever, so lost communities and so on. So it was really also like, an investigation of contemporary mechanisms. And it also kind of felt like it's a really good time to be looking at these historical ready-mades, because we're kind of witnessing just so much of hijacked culture in the name of ideology. So the Palace of Nations in Geneva is probably, it's a really interesting sort of case study, because of course this was a project which was, supposedly stopping the advent of the Second World War, but they take such a long time to just draft together the architectural competition, make the selection, build the thing, build the rooms, that actually when the palace opens, it operates only for a few months before it has to shut the doors because the war comes in. So I was kind of really reading it through that prism. And also it's a building that is filled with European colonial art, and they don't really know how to deal with it. So, you know, the artworks don't really have any tags. I'll come to that later. But this is the electricity station within the palace, and for me it was kind of quite symbolic heart of this sort of failed League of Nations. So the storyline of the film basically goes that is this fictitious competition for a perfect gift that will heal the nation, and we have three men that present their ideas for this perfect gift, and it's again based on archives. These are words from diplomacy, from architecture, and from art. So we have three positions that sort of propose those lines of thought, and then we have sort of each character has their own sort of, let's say, almost an avatar in a way. So diplomacy has music and so on. And this is also drawn from what actually, you know, all these sort of moments we're kind of coming up with. You know, so cultural diplomacy always kind of comes with music because it's kind of least offensive, of course. So Niemeyer's communist headquarters was supposedly a gift, but Niemeyer actually got in exchange for it an atelier on Champs-Élysées. And it's a really, I mean, it's an absolutely phenomenal building. I'm sure you all know it. That was kind of used as kind of centerfold for this competition. And again, you know, this is a really interesting case study because the French communists were kind of running out of power. They needed a new face. They were looking for a new architect. So this idea of this sort of futuristic sort of set was kind of quite cool for, you know, it's kind of quite old and kind of tired party at the time. And then the three gifts in the film are judged by 4 fundamental freedoms that I took from the Roosevelt speech with which they were trying to entice basically Americans to enter the Second World War. And just to kind of come back to Geneva, so when I was kind of talking about sort of European colonialism, so all these, so the entirety is built from, you know, I mean, it's gifted land, gifted architecture and so on, but also, you know, all the artworks were gifted. So this is a gift from Belgium, and it's a 1935 tapestry. It's called Peoples of the World. And what is really interesting is that, you know, as I said, like there's no tag, there's, you know, nothing that kind of points toward the problematization of it. And of course, all the European nations are, you know, represented by the women that are fully dressed, and all the sort of global south and so on is represented by women who are naked. And this was, I mean, I was kind of quite struck when I kind of found this, sort of hashtag multilateralism. And, you know, just to show that it's sort of, you know, we are kind of, you know, speaking of decolonization and all the issues that we are for years and years and years, but, you know, this is still a discourse that kind of needs to permeate within spaces of power, and they know they need to deal with it, but it's, you know, it's still not there critically. But what they are doing is, because also, as every building, it has wear and tear, so the European colonialism now has wear and tear, so there's, you know, leakages and so on, so they will probably have to change all these rooms. So what is happening now is that you can have the new capital coming in. So you now have, you know, you have UAE, you have Qatar coming in with, you know, the situations that look like, you know, the sand dunes, Bedouins in the desert. So this is the new, you know, the new aesthetic. And again, following with this project, I was then working again with the archive from the UN archives of the donations of songs and flags. Now, the League of Nations never had an official anthem, it never had a flag because they were so scared of nationalism. But it's this really, really beautiful, beautiful collection that is kind of, it also kind of comes with these letters. And this continued, so basically when the palace was shut, there would be these Sunday composers basically. These were not big names, but these were like really just, you know, I don't know, music teachers, you know, kind of local composers, and they were sending these compositions to this palace which was shut. So that was again like such a beautiful symbolic act, I thought, that I kind of really wanted to create a work out of it. So we were putting them into scores for the first time. We were performing them for the first time as kind of accompaniment to the segments of the film as well. And then the other section was these flags that I mentioned. And it was a similar thing here, but I guess like, you know, with the design you can kind of really see. And this was also then the problem with the building itself, because the original call for the palace was, but they just couldn't make up their mind, the committee, because, you know, of course every architect was either German or French or English. So they created a committee of 5 that had to work together. And you can imagine you kind of bring in 5 big male egos, architects who have to work together. Of course it's going to take a very long time. But they learned, the United Nations then learned their lessons, so the New York project was done very differently. So they were very, very expedient there. But it's, yeah, that was kind of an interesting story. And with the flags, again, you can kind of see much more clearly, you know, sort of specific nationalist styles and design. So, you know, this flag never existed, but it's also, it was a competition which was also donated to the palace. And yeah, again, this is a museum, Museum der Moderne in Salzburg. We kind of continued these ideas of kind of putting into song these variations and bits drawn from this archive to really kind of, you know, sort of perform it. And that was, yeah, I don't know why that's there, it's just Salzburg. But this is interesting. So this was Mac Leon, where we presented the gift for the first time as so it's a 3-channel film installation. But I kind of like extended it again with these sort of foyers and sort of this kind of experiential sort of behavioral patterns for the audience. And for the first time, I managed to actually create also the stage of the Miraculous Mandarin. So I kind of brought this other sort of part of this kind of scene setting into the story. And what I really like to do, so I always kind of work with female performers, and they're always young artists. And this is also like a big part of the project that, you know, we work with kind of like the next, you know, it is about the next generation. It's about the next generation of the female voices that will inhabit the center stages. So actually the Salzburg one I showed you, these were actually opera singers from Mozarteum. So these are really the girls that will be on the next, you know, elite stages of Europe. And what was really phenomenal was that their repertoire, what they are learning, is the same as it was sort of 100 years ago. So the costumes don't change, the repertoire doesn't change, what they have to do. So, and these were all master students, and we were chatting, and they said that their dissertations, they're all about sort of suicidal mothers and betrayed daughters. It's and it's again a kind of quite a, you know, perturbant part. So this was then the gift at Mac Leon. So the idea of the 3-channel film really was that, you know, so each character inhabits a screen, a camera, but also architecture is kind of this kind of continuous voice, and it continues to frame, it continues to be a cinematographer, a choreographer. And I guess this is another thing of why I'm kind of quite drawn toward these architectures that kind of lost this client, because in a way, you know, by losing this client, there's sort of maybe other avenues that you can kind of enter into conversations with. And this last film that I made, which is now, it's on view at the Triennial of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana until November, if anybody travels there. It's called Beacons, and it's probably the most poetic work I've done. I kind of wanted to go away from the archives, from the voices of the archive, and I translated it into a musical score. So I did work with an archive from Montenegro, of the cultural workers of the non-aligned. So this was this conference in 1985, 84, 85, that's wrong actually. But what is really interesting as well was that I kind of felt, well, it took a long time for the cultural workers to actually get together, so they can, and actually sit, you know, in one space and debate. And the words are really interesting. So they're basically arguing for self-determination, spiritual emancipation. So you have all the countries listed there. So you even have like North Korea, you have Palestine, and actually when you kind of look at all the nations that are present, you know, it's also all the kind of cultural sectors that have been erased, except if they are playing the role of geopolitical exoticism. So I wanted to really take these words, but you know, the essays are kind of quite long, they're quite lengthy, and so I took out from each contribution sentences that felt they were sort of like the call to action from the speaker. And then I took those and I gave them to 8 performers to perform them either as choreography or as musical instruments or as listeners into sort of this, let's say, sort of like translation, transcode. It's also transcoded in a way. So there's like loads of sort of machines, there's some Morse code, there's different algorithms. And then I used the architectures, but definitely not just modernist architectures. There's also Avala, as you saw. This is Belvedere in Bled. So, but all the structures that were used by sort of kind of patriarchal state constructions within our territory, former Yugoslavia, throughout the 20th century. But I brought in this idea of this female voice that started to use them as echoic chambers in a way. So that's Beacons. And as a kind of counterpart of the film was actually this photographic series that I did with Natalia and the other curators in the archive, where I took only the female busts and heads from the collection, and I photographed them inhabited by these moths, and sort of, so they kind of like become these vanitas images of this sort of potential solidarity, but also, you know, there is this questioning of how these gifts were given, who was making the selections, and, you know, there's a lot of this nascent nation states, of course, at this moment in time, so this kind of representation then of them via these sort of female figures was kind of quite key. And I just wanted to finish just with a little excerpt from State of Illusion, which was a video work, really more than a film, where I recreated the last pavilion of former Yugoslavia, but as an illusionist device. So this was Montreal in the late 60s. And this was the last time when Yugoslavia actually sent money abroad to create an exposition. And it was, of course, as always these expositions went, it was kind of quite a dramatic turn of events. They didn't want Richter, who was doing everything until then. They brought in a Serbian young architect, and it kind of almost ruined his career because it was such a flop. The project was effectively 7 triangular shapes, 6 representing the 6 republics and 1 the host country. Richter then did the interior, but I actually recreated it as this sort of actual magical illusionist device, which we filmed with a magician and her 3 henchmen with falling knives and fire and so on. This is just like a little trailer. And I can't hear it. Can I try to read? Do you think that's oh. Should we try it?
Nation building is the act of creating a set of illusions which confirm and reinstate a common ground amongst citizens. The art of nation building, as any true art, conceals the means with which it is achieved. Like any good drama, it does not only take place on stage, but in the minds of the audience. In his social contract, Rousseau introduces an imaginary perfect being whose role it is to help individuals evolve from the state of nature and enter into the social contract between the citizens and the state. This is the lawmaker, who transforms the individual into a member of the state, like a magician who secures the belief of her audience into a staged illusion.
So I thought this would be a really nice invitation to you all. I think we're all illusionists here. So yeah, I would really like to hear your thoughts, comments, and your experiences. Thank you. Thank you.